my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. In the first video of this series, I showed that the equalization program created by the federal government was a propaganda tool which had been designed to deceive people, especially in Quebec. In this second video, I will prove without the shadow of a doubt that for the last 260 years, Quebec has been subsidizing the rest of Canada and not the other way around. And to prove my point, I will put at the end of this video a very detailed bibliography so that anybody can verify what I say. First, let's say something totally obvious. In 1759, the British didn't attack us with guns and cannons because they wanted to give us money. Second, after the invasion, they never paid a cent for everything the French settlers had painstakingly built and developed in New France. Contrary to the British, the French didn't use violence to settle in Canada. They did it with the consent of the natives, who were quite happy to exchange some of their abundant furs for extremely useful European products like metal tools, mirrors, or wool blankets. During the following century, that trading relationship would be made official by the signing of different peace treaties. To protect their economic interests against any potential European competitor, the French did what the natives did inside the continent. They took the control of a choke point in the St. Lawrence Valley. While the natives fought among themselves to control the Montreal region, the French built Quebec City in a strategic location where it was possible to bombard any foreign ship trying to move upstream without their permission. After that, they developed the country and its economy by building cities and roads along the St. Lawrence River and by sending explorers further west to map the continent. Since New France was quite different from France, the French settlers worked very hard to improve and adapt their architecture, their clothes, their tools, and even the animals they had brought with them from France, for example, the Canadian horse. They even developed an agricultural system that took full advantage of the extensive river network of the colony. They also adapted to their needs the most efficient technologies invented by the natives, the canoe, the snowshoe, the moccasin, etc. After the invasion of 1760, the British would profit enormously from that huge investment without even realizing it. They also encouraged their merchants to take the control of the economy, which forced our superior classes to emigrate en masse elsewhere in the Americas or in Europe. The nobles, the civil servants, the army officers, the merchants, most of the clergymen, and the other members of our ruling classes who decided to leave the colony were so many that their properties were sold for almost nothing. This is how the most expensive and beautiful houses built in New France became the property of a handful of English merchants or civil servants. In 1763, the vast majority of the 60,000 French settlers who decided to stay in the colony belonged to the poorest and less educated working classes of New France. They were farmers and servants who didn't have enough money to immigrate and whose descendants would remain poorer than English Canadians up until today. It's so true that nowadays the federal government admits that every year the average Quebecer has $4,000 less in its pocket than the average Canadian. Check, it's in the bibliography. The fact of the matter is that 1763 was the year when the average French Canadian went from riches to rags, and it had nothing to do with Catholicism and the French language. During the following centuries, English Canadians would use all their military, legal, political, and financial power to keep the Quebec economy under their control, especially in Montreal, which was, and still is, the most important Canadian crossroads. On top of being kept artificially poor, French Canadians were also forced to pay many things in English Canada with their federal taxes. For instance, a large chunk of the debts accumulated by the English settlers and their descendants when 4 new provinces were created. But the most costly for them was the fact that the St. Lawrence Valley was so short, flat, and easy to equip that for more than 2 centuries, the federal government overtaxed Quebecers to pay for the development of the immense and extremely complex territories of English Canada. As I will now show you, the federal government spent so much money to build stuff in English Canada that the federal taxes of Quebecers paid much more than what was ever built in Quebec itself. In other words, there is not a cent spent in Quebec since 1760 that didn't come from Quebec. The systemic embezzlement I'm talking about started with Ontario. Since the St. Lawrence River was navigable till Montreal, much less money was spent to erect lighthouses along its shores than to build the artificial Lachine and Rideau canals that made possible the passage of boats between Montreal and Lake Ontario. That first lock system would be replaced in 1959 by the more complex and costly St. Lawrence Seaway, whose main economic consequence would be to displace a lot of industries from Montreal to Ontario. In both cases, Quebecers were forced to subsidize the development of Ontario and to accept the weakening of their own economy. Another huge investment made by Quebecers that would enrich Ontario was the building of 8 very tall bridges over the St. Lawrence River in Quebec. If those bridges are so tall and expensive, it's because they had to allow the passage underneath of the oceanic ships going to Toronto or elsewhere on the Great Lakes. The fact of the matter is that those ships never contributed a cent to the building cost of those bridges, which were paid in full by the municipal, provincial, and federal taxes of Quebecers, even those fully paid by the federal government. In Western Canada also, Quebecers were forced to make huge investments against their will or without their knowledge. Since there was almost nobody in the prairies or in the Rockies before the construction of the first roads and railroads, Quebecers paid with their federal taxes a disproportionate part of their construction costs when they were 50, 30, or 25% of the total Canadian population. Worse, Quebecers never profited from those investments since they almost never went farther than Ontario to do business, while English Canadians never stopped passing by the very strategic St. Lawrence Valley to reach the Atlantic Ocean or the landlocked part of Western Canada. It's even truer nowadays due to the fact that the Quebec economy is now oriented towards the American markets. Check, it's also in the bibliography. The systematic federal underinvestment in Quebec is totally obvious when we compare the total length of railways subsidized by the federal government in Quebec and in English Canada. It's even more striking when we take into account the fact that building a railway in the St. Lawrence lowlands cost much less than the complex railways built in the prairies or in the very high and underpopulated Rocky Mountains. If you saw the first video of this series, you already know that 4 locomotives are necessary to pull a train in the Rockies, while only 1 is necessary in a plain like the St. Lawrence lowlands. Similar remarks can be made for the roads subsidized by the federal government in the Northern Territories, or in the case of the Trans-Canada Highway. Look at the total length of that road in Western Canada and in Ontario and compare it with what was built in Quebec. Watch also how useful that highway has been to develop the towns located along the Ottawa River in Ontario and compare it with the underdevelopment of the opposite bank in Quebec. Here again, we must take into account the fact that it was much easier and economical to build a road in the St. Lawrence lowlands than in the very complex and costly territories of Western Canada. The result of it all is that after 260 years of English domination, modern Quebec, with 23% of the Canadian population, has only 18% of the large Canadian ports, 9% of the large Canadian airports, 17% of the military bases, a tiny part of the Trans-Canada biking trail, 9% of the federal national parks for a whooping 0.7% of the total area protected in Canada, etc., etc. As you can see, English Canada never gave anything to Quebec. It was clearly the other way around. Now, how can we calculate what English Canada owes to Quebec? Since most of the expenses we are talking about have been paid by Quebec a long time ago, the only way to calculate the modern value of all those expenses would be to use the mathematical formula that takes into account the accrued interests for any unpaid sum during a certain number of years. As you can verify here, if we use a quite reasonable 5% annual interest rate, $1 spent in 1867 is now worth $1,662. If we make the same calculation for each dollar spent or stolen in 1760, it is now worth more than $300,000. Now, do you still believe the propaganda when it says that Quebec owes something to English Canada? Don't forget that you can verify everything I said in this video with the bibliography that will appear on the screen in a few seconds. Please feel free to share this video on the internet. Thank you and see you next time.